Welcome to the main message for the 18th of April. Hope you're well. We're just going to continue in the series on living the resurrection. And this week, that striking phrase of Paul's, that statement in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 6, that we are to consider ourselves seated with Christ in his glory now. Anyway, let's get there in simple stages. The gospel tends to have this sort of double embrace dynamic. What I mean by that is, it will tell us, reassure us, God accepts you as you are. So that sounds good. But then it also says, but don't stay as you are. Grow and change as you follow Christ. You're not really following. Don't be content with your starting place as to be your finishing place. Start in your starting place wherever you are, but grow, develop, go on a journey with Christ, work at some things, make yourself better, as it were, with the help of God's Spirit, etc. I want you to imagine something with me, if you would. Well, actually, it's Paul, I think we're imagining it with. Have you ever had the situation where you go into a room, you're not quite sure where you fit in, and somebody beckons to you and says, come and sit with us, or something like that? That's very reassuring. It's very inclusive, very embracing. The picture I think Paul is painting is, imagine sort of entering the throne room of heaven, recognizing, of course, throne room of heaven is a symbol, not a physical place per se, as we saw in Book of Revelation, but we haven't time to pursue that one either. But imagine yourself in however you want to imagine the throne room in heaven. There's Jesus on the throne, and he looks up and he says, "Oh, come and sit with me." How would that feel? What emotions would you have if that was a physical experience for you in some kind of, I don't know, you get caught up to heaven or something? Okay, a few things to remember. That would definitely feel inclusive. That would definitely feel honouring. That would definitely feel reassuring. It might feel a little unsettling even. Like, no, hang on. Who am I to sit there with Christ? Yeah. Well, remember this. The ancient king's throne was a workstation, not an easy chair, not a sofa. It wasn't for being comfortable in, it was for doing your work from. The throne was where the monarch would sit, the sovereign would take root, as it were, for a session and do the stuff of being a monarch, listen to petitions, give rulings, make judgments, organize things, hear things that you needed to consider, take advice, all those kind of things would be happening. So workstation. So when we are seated with Christ, Jesus is saying to you, come and sit next to me. That's inclusive. And he's saying, I'm really busy with Dad's kingdom. I'm really busy with love and light and goodness and truth on the earth. Work with me here. Join me in my workplace, my centre of ministry. That may not be a comfortable place, but it is a very honouring place, and actually a very exciting place for any of us to find ourselves in. Paul is talking in Ephesians 6, and he uses the same image, very vividly similar, in my view, in Romans chapter 6, but in Ephesians 2, verse 6, he's following a sequence here. And we started it last week. That here is the strange way we are to understand the gospel in this double embrace, right? That 2,000 years before you and I were born, Jesus died for us. That must mean that Jesus, in some sense, died an aspect of the death that would otherwise be coming to you and me. Paul tells us that we died with him, and therefore we were buried with him, and therefore we rose at Easter with him, and now we are seated with him in the throne room of heaven, where the work of the kingdom is centred. And I've changed the way I'm expressing it, and that's intentional, so let me underline it. I've switched from encouraging you to think about this as an individual experience, you in the throne room being invited to sit next to Jesus, and I've switched it to what Paul actually said now. Said actually, of course, the invitation is to we. Paul says we are seated there. It's the corporate we of all the church. So he's saying, you people in Ephesus and me where I'm writing to you from, all people in the church everywhere, we are seated with Christ in his glory. Let's think a bit about that double thing, because it means there's two truths at work. I am very definitely here on planet Earth living this particular life, and I'm caught up with the everyday realities of breakfast, boredom, battles, beliefs, what I'm going to do tomorrow, memories, plans, relationships, whatever it is. The everyday stuff of being a human being on planet Earth. That's what I tend to be caught up with, the practicalities of everyday life. And heaven, I'm content to speak about as being there. And as we've thought before, convention is to think about heaven being up there. But of course, heaven and earth are not different places, as say Earth and Jupiter are different places, or this galaxy and another galaxy are different places. Heaven is not part of the places of the universe. So heaven is different, but heaven is not another place in the sense of space. But rather, heaven and earth are in a dynamic, overlaid one upon the other, if I can put it that way, exchanging traffic the whole time. Jesus is there and we are there with him in two senses, I suggest to you, and there isn't time to pursue them at depth. One is that he is there as our representative, just as the church represents Jesus on the earth, so Jesus represents the church in heaven. So he's a representative, just as Jesus died for you as your representative, so you were buried with him because he was your representative, so you were raised with him, and so you are seated with him as your representative. And then we switch and go, it's not just you, and it's all of us corporately. But there's a deeper thing at work here. Jesus taught that through the work of the Holy Spirit, our commitment to him and his commitment to us creates a unity of being between us. It's not we're the same person, we're not, we're different persons, but there's a unity in these between the person of Jesus and the person of you, between the person of Christ and the people of the church, that is profound, that is eternal, that is infinite, that is born out of the love, grace and purposes of God, well beyond the structures and timetables and everyday living of planet Earth. So it's a very deep thing. It's very mysterious, very, impossible, I think, to put into words, but I think we can capture the edge of what Paul is saying enough. So that's all quite deep. Time for the easy bit, the practicalities of everyday life. And here we are in a UK setting, re-emerging from the restrictions that have been associated with COVID. And in that emergence, we in the church are looking forward to, we hope before very long, being able to resume worshipping physically in the same place together, all at the same time, in that harmony and that gathering that matters so much to us. The double embrace of belonging on the earth, as you and I do, and in heaven at the same time, as you and I currently do, of living in Babylon, under the worldly system and its unjust economics and its prejudice and problems and so forth, living in Babylon, but having a citizenship, a belonging, an identity with the New Jerusalem, living here as everyday, ordinary people, whilst having a seat with Christ in glory. This double embrace applies perhaps very particularly to our worship. So let's take a look at that, because worship, perhaps as we saw in the first reading with the commissioning of the very first temple in Jerusalem, long time before Jesus, and a different building several times over by the time Jesus went to the temple, that this is the place in worship where heaven and earth come close together in a very powerful and particular way, when worship is real. And that's what we need to think about as we prepare to come back to worship in the same place at the same time together. There's a really important thing we have to remember before we make any plans and have any hopes about what that'll be like, because it's not going to be identical with the situation of a year ago plus, right? So how does the double embrace of worship work, where we are firmly on the earth and also deeply rooted in heaven in the same moment? And in a sense, worship, when we really worship, that distance between heaven and earth, it becomes the least separated and the most engaged with each other, perhaps. Well, have you ever caught yourself out for saying the words of the Lord's Prayer without praying? It's dead easy to do, isn't it? Once you've learnt the Lord's Prayer, once you've done it a few hundred times, it becomes easy to recite it instead of to pray it, doesn't it? Have you ever reached the end of a powerful hymn or a deep worship song, and you sung it, but really you were planning lunch, or you were thinking about what you did last week, or the worry that's on your mind or something, and you think, well, I did the actions, but there was no real engagement. So just as you can pray the Lord's Prayer, or you can say it without praying it, so you can go through any of the actions of worship without worshipping, because the worship is not in the actions, it's not in the song, it's not in the prayer itself, as in words spoken. It's not in that particular version of reading the Bible, or that particular way of being in church, or that particular venue that I have such fond associations with. Worship is created by God's Spirit in our hearts, because worship is a response to the grace of God, and it's a response to the presence of God. It's not a ceremony. And I wish we'd had time to look at Isaiah chapter 1. If you do have time, have a read of it. It's quite striking that God says, I don't like your ceremonies, the very ones I told you to carry out, because they're not fruitful. You're going through the motions, but you don't know who I am, and you don't know what I look for in life, and you're not listening to me, you're not engaging with me. You're doing religion, you're doing ceremonies. Stop it. We need some justice, and we need some fairness, and we need some love. Otherwise, your ceremonies are nothing. Worship is emotion. And the activities that we do are simply the ways we use to express some of those emotions and to stir them together. And so it's a heart matter created by the work of God's Spirit within us as we respond to the grace and the majesty and the wonder of God. And then we look for activity that expresses it. Now, how do you treat with these treasures of worship that are ours, some of which we've held for many years and are very special to us? Well, there's a simple gospel principle for treasure. You never use it selfishly. Treasure, wealth, riches are always for making sure that other people have what they need. That is the gospel imperative, unmistakably. So, in Cannington and Westfield URCs, we have a purpose statement for our worship, and it goes like this: that our worship will glorify God, nothing selfish there, build up God's people, meaning create a community of disciples whose discipleship is growing, whose faith is strengthening, whose mission is alive and active. Build up his people and draw others to Christ. That's what we've said. We've never said worship is so that you can be a consumer of your favourite songs, or that you can get us to do worship exactly how you want it. In fact, the only worship that works, this is key, so don't miss it, the only worship that really works and that doesn't end up abandoning the heart of worship is the worship that puts God and neighbour before self. So the task as we come back to worship together is to find out what we believe in this new phase of our church's lives glorifies God when we meet together. So that's a whole attitude of awe and reverence, humility. And so what glorifies God? What adores God? What builds up our churches to be centres of discipleship and people strengthening and encouraging one another in the faith and learning how to walk with Jesus? And what will be most useful to those who aren't even part of us, but might be? And when all that's said and done, we'll go, do you know what, guys? If we can, there's something I'd really like to do. I love this old song, or I love this new song, or I love this thing, or I love that. If that fits, I'd love it. But we can't turn it into a game of trying to get what we want as we talk with one another. It has to be grace and generosity, or it can't be anything to do with worship, can it? Because we may have our feet on planet Earth, where we learn to look after ourselves, but actually we are seated with Christ in heaven, where we learn to look after others. God bless you, and I hope this message makes some sense to you. I will do a slightly shortened supplement because this has gone just that little bit longer than usual, but I hope it's okay. God bless.